We're going to jump into a bit of conversation about social determinant factors, and also next we'll talk about epigenetics a little bit, which is a very interesting field. But we'll start with the social stuff. So what role do social determinants of health play in the neuroscience of mental health, and how are these factors addressed in therapy?
Okay, too many words. So the model that I've been developing for like 12 years is not really that complicated, but it is grounded in both developmental psychopathology and social determinants of health. And all it means is that who we are today is the manifestation of all the social determinants in our history. So I call it, today I call it the inheritance model. It's gone by many names over the various iterations of my writing in understanding the research. But I'm going to say this as quickly as I can without leaving out too much of the important stuff. So our origin story, it begins with a sociocultural world that we're born into that we had no choice in joining, right? We didn't make those decisions. The culture was the culture, the society was the society. And in that, our cultural norms, societal norms, the period in history, the part of the planet we're born onto, the different economic forces and social issues, so forth. And in that context, our genetic blueprint is laid down. So we are given this sort of biological and hereditary inheritance, literally, that, again, will shape. You and I were talking about this a little bit at the beginning before we logged on, before others logged on, Pedro, about often we're born with the nervous system that we're born with, and that for me, that just means I'm pre-wired for anxiety, and you might be a lot more chill. But some of that is biological inheritance, as with health factors, like there are health conditions that we're born with or not born with. And then the third is the early relationships. So we didn't choose our early caregivers, and yet they absolutely have a huge role to play in how our nervous system forms. Then we're born into specific environments, and more research is coming out on the deleterious effects to the nervous systems of individuals in exposed to environmental pollutants, dirty drinking water, air quality, other environmental toxins. And then the environment can also include the immediate environment, the intactness of the family or not. And then in that context, we have experiences, and these experiences shape how our nervous system is built. So what am I saying with all that? Good question. So in terms of thinking about social determinants of health, we have sort of these 5 stages of development in our early part of our life that form the foundation of our nervous system. And we didn't have any choice in any of those. And yet, at a certain point in our life, then we become responsible for living with that nervous system that was the result of somebody else's decisions. And so, for me, this is powerful because, as I mentioned to you a little bit before, I think step 1 is learning our nervous system, and step 2 is making peace with the nervous system that we inherited. And so this is just a drop in the bucket of the broader literature on social determinants of health. But I think when we start to have a more sophisticated understanding of the origin story of individuals, it makes sense how those precursors, those inherited features of experience, are manifested in thought patterns, feelings, behaviors, patterns of relating, and then general experiencing of the world. And so I think that where we're coming to with understanding the integration of neuroscience into clinical practice is a more complete picture of the individual that's sitting before us. So it's not about blaming our parents or our culture, and it's not about taking away the responsibility of the individual to live their life as fully as they can, but wow, when we start connecting the dots, we have a lot of options for where we want to intervene in addressing some of those social determinants. Again, social determinants of health theory and practice is a lot richer than what I just described, but I wanted to give you a quick look at how I think about that today.
Now, that's a good overview. Thanks a lot, Chad. And I'm going to link that one up with our questions about epigenetics and how that influences mental health and what it means for therapy. And I'll just preface that question with a quick definition of epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So one example of this would be transgenerational trauma, and how that impacts behavior, and I guess that sensitivity that you're talking about in relation to how you're born and how your nervous system is wired. So do you have any comments about that, or some interesting insights with regards to how this information can be useful in clinical practice when working with clients, obviously clients that have a history of trauma they may not even be aware of because it might be, in a previous generation, or they may be aware that it existed, but not that it's affecting them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. As we think about using genograms or family trees to get further back in the origin story, like where some of the things that seem mysterious today that are popping up maybe popped up in the past. I like thinking about epigenetics as is really how the environment activates gene expression or leads to gene expression, which means things that were previously asleep are now awake, and now you've got to clean up after that. A parallel concept to epigenetics is experience-dependent plasticity, and all that means is that if the environment activates genes, experiences can activate nervous system adaptations. And so you have two forces acting on an individual that make modifications somewhat against their will. and so one of the ways to work with this in session is, again, so we'll go back to addictions. When I work in addictions treatment, I do a lot of talking about sort of how their origin story makes sense, that in many cases they couldn't be anything other than who they've become. And so there's a place for them to be kind of kind to themselves. But like the question that I ask is, what if your substance use disorder is not your fault, but it is now your responsibility? And it typically comes from, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, a bad joke. Two people walk into a bar, one walks out and the other has to be carried out. Like it's really not a fair situation that two people go into a bar and have the same alcohol encounter, except genetically they have a very different encounter. And so I think there's a lot of rage in addiction treatment that some people can use recreationally and some people can't. And when they realize, that second group of people, when they realize that they can't, it often feels too late, or at least for a certain period of time in their life. And I think that knowing that you inherited vulnerabilities that weren't apparent to you until you engaged in a certain type of behavior is a really upsetting experience to walk with people through. And I think it's an important one. So you see this also with physical trauma, people who might get in a car accident and it might unlock something that was there. We see this so often with PTSD that, statistically 10 people could go through the same experience and only a couple of them are going to walk away with meeting the criteria for PTSD. Well, what did they do wrong to make that happen? They didn't. They just inherited a vulnerability that they didn't know about until it happened. Again, multiple opportunities to extend grace to individuals, because, if you struggle with something and kicking the crap out of yourself for struggling with it was effective, fewer people would have kind of psychological issues because we're really good at beating ourselves up. I think we talked about that earlier too. So that's my little take on epigenetics. Again, just scratching the surface.
Thanks, Chad.